Hi there, Logic Language Learners. This is a request video from somebody who is very loyal to Logic Language Learning. An Elizabeth Guiney. Elizabeth, I hope I'm pronouncing your surname properly. I know we've corresponded, recently quite a lot. So she has sent a very interesting question. Dear Luke, thank you for your many excellent videos. They are my go-to. Like I say, how can you refuse a request video when somebody opens like that? But obviously, I get to them in a list because I obviously have a backlog. I wonder if you could advise me on this, please. In my local French class, lovely to know that you're doing one, Elizabeth, led by an English teacher. Well, by definition, if she means English nationality, there's plenty of people who are English nationality who speak well. Often when people have learned a language, they've got a grammatical acquisition of a language which is often superior to people who go on nuance and sense, and is often not. So it just sort of depends. I certainly wouldn't dismiss anybody's capabilities as a teacher for not being native. It just depends, how often they work and how much French is part of their organic life, or any language. So I translated the phrase, I imagined that it would be easier, as j'ai imaginé, and I will write this underneath in the description box. J'ai imaginé. So those of you that don't realise, when I say description box, you have to click the little arrow underneath and it opens it up. So j'ai imaginé que ce serait plus facile. J'ai imaginé que ce serait plus facile. But she corrected me and told me that I should have said je me suis imaginé que ce serait plus facile. Now, I would be grateful for an explanation, please, and have bought you 2 well-earned coffees. Thank you. So this is why I have to get around to these request videos when someone has paid for them in coffees on the Kofi website, which is basically a way for me to have a coffee, just to say thank you. It's not an obligation, but it's very much appreciated, and I have to say, and thank you, Elizabeth. Right, so first things first. I've written Elizabeth's I can't even think of the word. I've written Elizabeth's email. I've copied Elizabeth's writing exactly as it is. So the first thing is to say that the je me suis imaginé doesn't have an extra e on it. When you use an extra e, so let's quickly talk about this. When you use an être verb, that means a verb which conjugates with être in an auxiliary tense, as in with no reflexive, no pronominal. So just je suis allé, tu es allé, je suis monté, il est arrivé, whatever. One of the going ins, the going outs. Some of you might know them as Mr. and Mrs. Dr. Van der Trump. I'm not sure. There seems to be various things that people use to remember them. It's never been my method to remember them. I always just think about yourself moving basically around the space. But if you've got one of those weird mnemonic things that you use for that, Mr. and Mrs. Van den Trampt or something, then by all means write it underneath, because we'd love to see it. But so when you use one of those verbs, je suis imaginé, je suis allé, whatever, categorically, if you are a feminine person speaking, you identify as feminine, then you are going to have an E on the end when you write that down, and plural will have an S, feminine plural ES, etc. When it comes to pronominal, so when it comes to reflexive usage or reciprocal usage, or basically je me suis, tu t'es, il s'est, nous nous sommes, vous vous êtes, ils se sont, plus a past word, you don't automatically add the E or the S on the end just because it's got an être auxiliary. You would only do that if the verb was being done to the person doing the subject. So for example, I imagined myself, meaning like, I physically imagined myself rather than to myself kind of thing, then yes you would, but in that case it wouldn't be. So for example, I got washed and I'm a woman, we got washed, nous nous sommes lavés. We were the thing doing the verb, we were the thing being washed, therefore laver would have an extra E and an extra S. We spoke to each other, let's imagine we were both women, nous nous sommes parlé. Although the same structure, we were not the thing being spoken, so therefore it wouldn't have the E and an S. So that's the first thing. Right, Basically, this is very subtle, but I would actually say that your teacher is right. So here are some different nuances of s'imaginer, which is what we're talking about, versus imaginer. So again, I'm really into at the moment teaching you to do your own kind of research. So we'll look at some of the answers that people have put on, I think I'm just using word reference today. But as I teach these verbs, imaginer versus s'imaginer has two kind of ideas. The first one, to use what am I saying? Tu t'imagines, je m'imagine, yeah. To use je m'imagine is basically, there are two possibilities. Either you are literally saying, I picture myself, I imagine myself. So for example, if you were like, at that age, you know, I thought that I was going to become a whatever, you know, je m'imaginais plutôt comme en tant que whatever, you know. That, so in other words, you are quite literally imagining yourself. And that is quite a common, you know, a common, you know, a common representation of the verb. The second one, which is subtle, because in English it would be, oh, I imagined that it would be, you know. There are different things, but one is to imagine to yourself. Let me just get rid of that. That's making anything. One is to imagine to yourself, as opposed to imagine something else. So the idea is that you are sort of almost, the nuances that you're sort of almost making a mistake. As in, we'll talk about the definitions in a second, but one, imaginer is sort of like that you are imagining something else very clearly. You can picture it, you suppose, you whatever, there's something else there. And s'imaginer is like you to your little self in your own little brain are imagining that. And the nuance in French is often that there is there's an error there. It might not necessarily be true. So imaginer can be like to picture something, to create an image, to you know, based on fact or truth as well, or you know, or whatever. But s'imaginer is often like tu t'imagines n'importe quoi. You're imagining all kinds of things. There's a nuance of error that goes with that. Another thing would be if you then use the inversion. So if you said like imagine-toi, you know, or imaginez-vous, that's kind of, although it's the inversion with the reflexive, with the pronominal, that doesn't necessarily mean anything else. That's just a way of sort of pulling you into it, as in, you know, you picture it for yourself. So those are the kind of ideas. You've got imaginer with something that you can imagine. S'imaginer either because you literally do imagine yourself, you know, in a situation. You know, he thought he would be with her, you know, il s'imaginait avec elle. But, or that idea that it's possibly wrong, as in, so he thought he'd wind up with her, but he then didn't. Or, like I said, this idea that you're taking it sort of for yourself, you know, for your own sort of pleasure rather than that's literally what's happening. So let's have a look at some of the imaginer versus s'imaginer stuff. So first things first, if I go to imaginer, and all I've done is go to imaginer on word reference. So imaginer, to invent. So Marie invented a new product. So imaginer is the idea of coming up with something. Your imagination has created it. So that's nice as well for a start. So it's got that whole, you know, that's another usage of imaginer. So for example, Marie a imaginé un nouveau produit. Marie imagined a new product. Came up with would be a better thing. Okay, so that's nice. Okay. Is it possible to imagine a car-free city? So the verb it's often offered you there is concevoir, to conceive of. So again, in English you've got conceive of, imagine, conceive of being quite formal as it says there. Yeah, in your conception. So peut-on imaginer une ville sans voiture? Okay, you know, as in can you imagine that? Can you picture that? I think would be a nice one. The next one is like suppose, as in I suppose that. I imagine that you're coming this evening. I suppose that you're coming this evening. Assumption. Yeah? J'imagine que vous viendrez. So notice in the text it's that you will come. There's no subjunctive or anything silly like that. Don't be thinking, oh, well, if you're imagining it, it's not definite. As we talked about in a video more than recently, the 70% rule. Probability as well as certainty goes to the normal, goes to the indicative. Okay, possibility is 50-50, it will go subjunctive. Probability will go indicative, will go normal. So imagine that you're coming. J'imagine que vous viendrez, if you look in the example, will be the will be the future simple. Aussi à cette soirée, imagine you're also coming to this party. I suppose you're coming to this do as well, it's translated as. Good. So the next one is getting a little bit into the dreaming thing, as in something that you'd possibly want. But notice you can do this to someone else. So, ils imaginent leur fils en pilote d'avion, en tant que pilote d'avion. So basically, you know, ils imaginent leur fils, so that's something they want for their son. So that would be like to dream of. Yeah, okay. So again, but that is still being done to someone else. Now, rather disappointingly, when we get to s'imaginer, the translation is, and I can imagine you probably already looked this up, Elizabeth, it's got imagine and think. Imagine's not really helping us, is it? I mean, that's been further up the page. And the rather useless example it gives us is qu'est-ce que tu t'imagines? What do you imagine? The nuance there that's quite nice though is that you haven't then got an object afterwards. You know, it would have a tendency to be tu t'imagines because there's not an article. There's not an article. Get real, Luke. There's not an object after that. So it's not like tu imagines quoi, it's more like qu'est-ce que tu t'imagines? Like basically, because you're not saying you imagine something, it kind of works there in French to come in with the reflexive. That works quite nicely, as in what you're picturing for yourself. There's not necessarily the supposition of error in what that person is thinking for themselves at that time. So, like I said, there's different strands to s'imaginer versus imaginer, Elizabeth. Right, the next one is a lot more useful. Croire à tort. Croire à tort. Tort being wrong. We don't often hear tort. Those of you that know anything about law will know that in legal speak we have tort, as in error and who's in the wrong. So j'ai raison is I'm right, j'ai tort is I'm wrong, but we just tend to say t'as pas raison, you know, you're not right. So ils s'imaginent qu'ils sont plus forts que nous. Okay, they imagine that they're stronger than us. The idea is that you're, and that's, you know, croire à tort is not necessarily helping the English speaking learner, that's wrong. Yeah, so as in, you know, they in their own brains imagine that they're wrong. No, they in their own brains imagine that they're stronger than us, but they're not. So that's again one of the principal uses of s'imaginer, is when there's an error about what you imagine versus what the truth is. I'd imagine for a lot of people that's probably the case anyway, but that's what it is. Okay, so that's what's going on in the definitions. And sometimes word reference forums get very repetitive, sometimes they don't really solve anything, it just goes off on a tangent. I'm always interested in reading where someone is from. I mentioned that previously. In your own research work, look at whether or not they're native or whatnot. But that is not to criticise anybody. I've read some fantastic comments over the years from people who are not native, and I really have to stress that. And I've read some really bland, I don't know, we just kind of do, comments from people who are native, which is also useful because it kind of gives you the skimming the top of the surface kind of ideas on stuff. So what has somebody said there? There's a conversational thread that I thought was quite useful. So, franco fou, okay, which fou being mad, okay. So, bonjour, je n'arrive pas à comprendre la différence entre le verbe et le verbe pronominal. Tristesse, pourriez-vous m'aider un peu? J'imaginais que tu étais amoureux de moi dans mes rêves. Contre j'imaginais que tu étais amoureux de moi dans mes rêves. Merci d'avance, franco fou de. So, hi there, I'm not able to understand, notice arrivé for I'm not able to understand the difference between the verb and the pronominal verb, pronominal being reflexive. Or, well, with a pronoun. It might not just be reflexive, it could be reciprocal, it could be indirect, it basically means with a pronoun. I sometimes lazily call them reflexive verbs, so you know what we're on about. Pronominal basically means with the pronoun, so je, me, tu, te, il, se, nous, vous, vous. So in other words, it means the form of the pronoun. Pourriez-vous m'aider un peu? Notice there is a hyphen when you have an inversion. Could you help me a bit? J'imaginais que tu étais amoureux de moi dans mes rêves versus je m'imaginais que tu étais amoureux de moi dans mes rêves. Merci d'avance. Right, so let's look at some of the responses. Jean-Paul, which I think is a play on words with Jean-Paul. I think they've basically just written that in a weird way to be amusing. On peut dire que ces deux exemples ont le même sens. We could say that both of these examples have got the same sense, mean the same thing.